After the divorce, there wasn't much left for Mason to hold onto. No home of his own. No closeness with the friends who had quietly chosen sides. And no desire to fight for a city life that had already moved on without him. At 28, broken and drifting, he packed up what little he owned and drove south to Chatham, Alabama, a place he barely remembered from childhood visits. His grandfather's old house stood about 10 minutes outside of town, settled deep in the woods on 10 acres of land no one else wanted. It was quiet out there. Too quiet. Mason thought he needed that, the stillness, the escape, the kind of space that didn't press in on him with reminders of failure. The house had been empty since his grandfather died, passed down to the family like an afterthought. It creaked and groaned with age, wooden floors that whispered with every step, doors that never quite shut right, and an unshakable cold that clung to the walls no matter how high he cranked the thermostat. But it was free, and Mason had nowhere else to go. The first week passed uneventfully. He cleaned, unpacked, tried to build some kind of routine. Nights were spent on the porch, watching the moonlight tangle itself in the treetops, sipping cheap beer while the wind danced through the pines. There were no cars, no neighbors, just the occasional owl or distant rustle of deer. For a moment, it felt peaceful, but peace doesn't last in Chatham. Not when you're living in that house. Not when spring rolls around. It started on the 7th night. Mason had just slipped into bed, the digital clock flashing 1:12 a.m. when he heard it, whistling. A slow, broken tune carried through the trees like someone trying to hum a melody they'd long forgotten. It wasn't a song Mason recognized. And it wasn't just wind. It was deliberate, human. It started somewhere behind the house, meandering through the woods like someone walking with no real destination, just whistling for the sake of being heard. At first, Mason wrote it off. Maybe a neighbor, drunk and wandering, or a hunter out late. But something about it made his skin crawl. Something off-key, something wrong. The next night, the whistling came again, closer this time. Same hour, same eerie tune. Mason got up, turned on the porch light, and stepped outside with a flashlight. Nothing, no footprints, no crackling underbrush, just the whistling, fading back into the trees like whoever it was had no reason to hurry. Mason didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed with his ears straining for every sound, heart pounding at every creak of the house. He told himself it was nothing. Until it kept happening, night after night, always around 1:17 a.m., like clockwork. The whistling returned, each time a little nearer, a little bolder. Mason stopped going outside. He locked the doors, checked every window twice. He even wedged chairs under the knobs, just to be sure. But the whistling didn't stop. It grew confident. It circled the house. One night it came from behind the shed. Another night, right outside the front door. 3 long, breathy whistles, then silence. Then, impossibly, it came from under the floorboards. From inside the house. Mason's mind fractured that night. He lay awake, clutching a shotgun he barely knew how to use, shaking with every whistle that floated up through the vents. The next morning, he tore through the attic looking for anything his grandfather might have left behind. What he found chilled him to the core. A dusty box filled with leather-bound journals, his grandfather's. Page after page, entry after entry, the same thing. The same whistling, the same time, the same feeling of being watched. His grandfather had been haunted too. Not just once, not just briefly. For over 10 years, Mason's blood ran cold. He called the local sheriff's office. And that's when Deputy H showed up. An older man with tired eyes who'd been working the county longer than Mason had been alive. When Mason explained what was happening, the deputy didn't laugh. He didn't shrug it off. He just went real still and said, "Your granddaddy used to call us about the same thing. Said someone was whistling around the property late at night. Always in the spring. We never found anything. Figured maybe it was just age, but now you're hearing it too." The fear in Mason's chest turned sharp. This wasn't a ghost story. It wasn't sleep deprivation. Something real was happening, and it had been happening for years. That night, Mason didn't sleep. He sat in the dark with his grandfather's shotgun across his lap and all the lights off. At 1:17 a.m., the whistling started, not outside. Inside. From the hallway. It moved closer, step by step. When he shouted, "Who's there?" the whistling stopped. He turned on the light. No one, but he knew what he'd heard. And then the next night, knocking. 3 slow, hollow knocks from the back door. Then creaking floorboards. Then a figure. Pale, silent, unmoving, standing in the hallway. Mason ran. He drove to town in a frenzy. Slept in his truck. The next morning, Deputy H checked the house. The front door was unlocked. No forced entry. Whoever had been there had a key. Mason changed the locks that day and left the house behind. Forever. Some things you can't explain. Some places don't want you living there. And some people, whoever they are, never leave. If you felt the chill in Mason's story, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel after 0 hours for more real encounters just like this. Your support helps us keep sharing these stories and giving people like Mason a voice. Stay safe, and remember, some doors should never be opened. But it didn't end there, not with Mason shaking in the front seat of his truck. Not with the changed locks or the heavy silence that followed. It got worse, more personal, more inside. The house, his grandfather's house, no longer felt like a boundary between him and whatever was circling it. Something had changed that night after the hallway. Something had shifted. It was no longer about being seen or stalked, it was about being reached. Touched. Hunted. That pale figure in the hallway hadn't just watched him. It had measured him, and Mason knew, deep in his chest, that this wasn't a random event. It was a continuation, a pattern passed down like property, unwanted, inherited terror, threaded through generations like rust in the nails of that house. He tried to pretend the silence meant it was over. But silence doesn't mean peace. Sometimes, silence is permission. Sometimes, silence means it's your turn. 2 nights after the hallway incident, Mason returned to grab the last of his things. He didn't want to stay long. Just long enough to get some old letters. A box of photos. A coat his mother had given him in high school. The house looked the same in the late afternoon sun, still and weathered. Like it was holding its breath. But Mason didn't hear anything strange. Not then. He packed what he needed. Locked the new locks behind him. And left the porch light on, like his grandfather used to. That night, he tried to sleep in a motel just outside town. One of those roadside places with flickering signs and floral bedspreads that always smell faintly like mold and cigarette ash. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, telling himself the nightmare was over, that he was safe now. But at 1:17 a.m., his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number. It was a Chatham area code. His hand shook as he picked it up. He didn't say hello. He didn't have to. On the other end of the line, whistling. The same broken, off-key tune. Mason didn't wait. He hung up, threw his things in the truck, and drove, his vision blurred with rage and terror. Whoever it was, they weren't just watching, they were following, calling, reaching. As he pulled into his parents' driveway 3 hours later, the night still thick around him, he finally let himself cry. For the first time since the divorce, since the move, since the hallway, he let the fear spill out. Because this thing, this person, whatever it was, it knew who he was now. Not just where he lived. It knew him, his voice, his bloodline, and worse, it had waited for him. Mason spent 2 weeks away. His father agreed to handle the sale of the house. His mother walked around him on eggshells, worried he was slipping into something too deep to reach. But Mason didn't talk much. He spent most of the time staring out the window, listening for wind that might carry a melody. He jumped at knocks on the door. He avoided mirrors at night. He kept the lights on in every room he entered. But he wasn't falling apart, he was watching, learning, just like it had done to him. Then, one night, back at his parents' house, it happened again. He was brushing his teeth when he heard it, barely audible at first. Like it was coming from far down the street. Whistling, same tune. Mason turned off the water. Heart hammering. He stepped into the hallway. His parents were asleep. The house was still. He walked to the front door and looked through the peephole. No one there. But the whistling got louder. And then, 3 knocks. Soft, deliberate. On the back door. Mason didn't scream. He didn't run. He walked, slow, steady, to the kitchen. Gripped the edge of the counter. And waited. 30 seconds passed. Then a voice, muffled through the door but unmistakable. Mason, open up. It's me. I just want to talk. He recognized the voice. It was his own. Mason's knees buckled. He never opened that door. The next morning, he told his parents everything. They believed him, or at least, they didn't argue. His father canceled the sale of the house. The sheriff was called again. But this time, Deputy H never showed. Another officer said he'd retired just 2 days ago. Moved out of state. No forwarding address. Mason asked if anyone had taken over his case, about the intruder. The calls. The figure in the hallway. The deputy blinked. There's no open case. No reports had been filed. That night, Mason went back to the house one last time. He needed answers. If his grandfather had dealt with this for a decade, there had to be more. Something hidden. Some clue to explain who, or what, had been tormenting them. He scoured the attic again. Then the shed. Then, finally, the crawl space. He braced himself and slid under the house, dragging a flashlight and crowbar behind him. It was damp, cold, smelled of rot and time. And then he saw it. A box, wrapped in a tattered blanket, covered in dust, tucked in the far corner like someone had tried to forget it existed. Inside were newspaper clippings, missing persons. All from the county. One every spring. All over a 10-year span. He flipped through them, heart pounding, until he found one marked in red ink. The name was familiar. His grandfather's neighbor. Disappeared in 98. The article said she vanished one night after reporting a prowler outside her home. Mason dropped the paper. His breath caught. On the back of the clipping, written in shaky, familiar handwriting, was a warning. It waits until you're alone. It learns your voice. It wants in. Mason crawled out of the darkness. Chest heaving, eyes wild. He didn't take the box. He left it there, buried it deeper than before. He walked out of that house, turned around only once, and whispered, "You don't get me." Then he got in his truck and drove. He lives in a small apartment now, in a noisy city where he can hear sirens and traffic and shouting through the walls. He doesn't go anywhere alone. He doesn't answer calls from unknown numbers. But still, every spring, on a random night, just after 1:17 a.m., he leaves the lights on. Because sometimes, when the wind dies down, and the night turns still, he hears it, just faintly. That same, broken tune. Still waiting, still watching. And now you know the story. If this gripped you like it gripped Mason's life, please like, share, and subscribe to After 0 Hours. Your support brings light to the dark corners others try to forget. And remember, if you ever hear whistling when no one should be there, don't follow it. Don't open the door. Mason didn't just leave that house behind, he left a part of himself buried in its walls. In the floorboards that moaned with secrets. In the air that seemed to hold its breath each spring. When he moved to the city, he told himself he was starting over. He got a job fixing HVAC units, quiet work that kept him moving. Kept him tired. He found a tiny apartment with thin walls and too much traffic outside. But that was the point. He wanted the noise. He craved it. Silence meant something could sneak up on you. But even surrounded by a million distractions, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that the whistling had followed him. Sometimes, he'd wake up at 1:17 a.m. on the dot, sweating, ears straining in the dark. Once, he even tore his apartment apart. Sure, he'd heard something humming beneath the vent. There was nothing, always nothing, and yet, he never felt alone. But what broke him wasn't the terror. It wasn't even the figure in the hallway or the voice at the back door. What finally made Mason unravel was the slow realization that his grandfather hadn't just lived with this horror, he had suffered through it alone. For over a decade, his grandfather had locked his doors, checked the windows twice, slept with a rifle by his bed, and never told a soul. Except maybe Deputy H, and even then, no one really listened. Mason remembered now, in fragments, how quiet his grandfather had become in his final years. How he never sat on the porch after dark. How the TV was always on late, volume up too high. How he'd say things like, "Sometimes the woods call your name, but it ain't you they want." Mason thought it was just old man talk, eccentric rambling, but now he knew better. One day, about 3 months after the last incident, Mason got a call from his mother. She sounded rattled, said she was cleaning out some of the old storage boxes in their basement and found a tape, an old cassette labeled in faded pen, "Spring." "03 for Mason, do not play alone." His stomach dropped. His grandfather's handwriting, his name. His mother hadn't played it. Said it gave her a bad feeling. Mason asked her to overnight it to him. He stared at that package for a whole day before he worked up the nerve to open it. He borrowed an old tape recorder from a second-hand shop. When he finally pressed play, he half expected static, or silence, What he heard instead hollowed him out. The recording was low, muffled, but unmistakably his grandfather's voice. "If you're listening to this, Mason, then you know. I prayed you wouldn't. God, I prayed you'd never have to deal with this thing. I never knew what it was. Just that it comes. Every spring. Every year. And it learns. It waits, till you're alone. Makes you hear things. Then it gets closer. It wants in. You give it a name. It remembers. You speak to it. It listens. Don't let it know you. Don't let it inside." The tape clicked softly. Then, whistling. Clear as day. Right into the recorder. Mason dropped it. Stumbled back. Bile rising in his throat. It was the same tune. The same twisted, broken melody. But hearing it on a tape from 2003, knowing it had haunted his grandfather just as it haunted him, shattered something inside him. He cried that night. Not from fear, but grief. Deep, aching grief for a man he never really got to know. A man who'd fought something invisible and unexplainable alone for 10 years. Carrying that weight quietly. Until the day he died. But the real sympathy came a week later. Mason decided to visit his grandfather's grave. He hadn't been back to Chatham since the locks were changed and the box in the crawlspace was reburied. He drove in silence. When he got to the cemetery, he brought a single sunflower, his grandfather's favorite. The sky was gray, the wind sharp. He stood there for a long time, just whispering things he wished he'd said when the man was alive. "I'm sorry you went through it alone," he said. "I'm sorry I didn't know. I would have believed you. I do believe you." That's when he noticed the paper. Folded neatly, tucked under a rock at the base of the headstone. He picked it up slowly. Heart thudding. It was an old page from a library book. On it, a single line was underlined in red ink. "The forest calls in voices it has stolen." No signature. No context. Mason dropped the paper like it had burned him. That night, at his motel just outside of Chatham, he dreamed of his grandfather for the first time. But it wasn't peaceful. His grandfather stood at the edge of a dark forest. Hands outstretched. Lips moving but making no sound. Behind him, something moved in the trees, too tall. Too pale. Eyes black and endless. Mason tried to run, but he couldn't. He was rooted, just as his grandfather had been. He woke up screaming. And then, just outside the motel window, whistling. He didn't open the curtains. He didn't move, just sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the recorder like a lifeline. You see, Mason isn't just a character in a spooky tale. He's a man who inherited something no one asked for. A legacy of silence, fear, and survival. He didn't run because he was weak. He endured because he was alone. Just like his grandfather. And that's why he left the house. Not to escape, but to break the pattern. To tell someone. To warn someone. And now, he's told you. If you felt the weight of what Mason went through, if you understood that this isn't just about fear, but about being believed, please like, share, and subscribe to After 0 Hours. Your support gives people like Mason a voice. And maybe, just maybe, if we listen closely enough, someone else won't have to go through it alone. Whatever it is, it waits. But now, we wait too. Together. After the graveyard. After the tape. After the motel window and the whistling that threaded its way through Mason's every quiet moment. He stopped pretending he could outrun it. You can't outrun something that learns you. That watches through cracks in the floorboards and memorizes your voice through vents. But what Mason could do, what he had to do, was sever the last tie between himself and the place that birthed the nightmare. The house. His grandfather's house. Still standing. Still silent. Still waiting. Mason hadn't told anyone, not even his parents, that he was going back one last time. Not to live. Not to look. To finish it. To take whatever pieces of his soul still lingered inside those walls and burn the rest to ash. Because some places aren't meant to be passed down. Some places are graves. The drive was tense. Too quiet. The highway stretched endlessly in front of him like it was daring him to turn back. He didn't. He arrived just before dusk. The house stood exactly as he remembered, like time had stopped. Like it was holding its breath, watching for him through the windows. But it didn't hum this time. It didn't whisper. It just waited. That was almost worse. As if it knew this was the end. Mason stepped inside. The air hit him like a wall, musty. Cold. A hint of something sweet rotting beneath the wood. Dust floated like ghosts in the light slicing through the broken blinds. He walked room by room, collecting only what truly mattered. His grandmother's locket, His grandfather's army photo, a few letters, the shotgun. He moved quietly, methodically, but as the sun fell below the trees, that hush settled in again. The one he'd learned to dread. The one that didn't mean peace. The one that meant it was listening. He poured gasoline across the floors, the baseboards, the entryway. He lit candles in the corners, not for light, but because his grandfather had written once that fire keeps it confused. Then he stood in the center of the living room, looked at the cracked ceiling, and whispered, "I'm not afraid of you. Not anymore." It answered. At 1:17 a.m. sharp. The hallway light flickered and died. Mason stood still. The whistling began, not from outside, not from beneath, from within the walls. He could hear it crawling, moving, coiling around the house like it had waited all year to come home. And then, a voice. His grandfather's voice. "Mason." It rasped through the vents. "Come outside. I want to show you something cool." He wanted to scream. He wanted to cry. Instead, Mason reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the lighter, and dropped it into the pool of gasoline at his feet. The fire caught immediately, racing like a hungry animal toward every corner of the house. The smoke thickened fast. Mason turned and ran, through the front door, across the porch, down the overgrown steps, breath ragged, tears streaming from heat and something deeper. Behind him, the house groaned, not just from the fire, from something else, from rage. And then, he heard it. A scream, a full-bodied, inhuman wail that tore through the trees and split the night open. The kind of scream that doesn't come from vocal cords, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere wrong. Mason fell to his knees in the yard, gasping, watching the fire eat through decades of wood and memory. But the scream didn't stop. It changed, broke into 1,000 voices. His grandfather's, his mother's, all crying out from inside that house like it was dragging every version of him into its maw. And then, footsteps behind him. Slow, wet, heavy, on the dead grass. Mason turned. There it stood. Not pale now. Blackened, burning, shifting, like it had no true form. Only echoes of the lives it had studied. Its eyes were his grandfather's. Its mouth was his own. And it smiled, not with lips, with something deeper, a knowing. It raised a charred hand, pointed back at the fire, and whispered, "Next spring." Mason blinked, and it was gone. The fire crews arrived 20 minutes later, summoned by someone who saw the smoke from the highway. By then, the house was gone, nothing but smoldering wood, glowing embers, and a silence so heavy it made men whisper. Mason gave a statement, arson. Accidental. He didn't say what really happened. How do you explain to someone that a house can remember you? That it can wear your grandfather's voice like a mask and crawl beneath your bed and wait years just to knock 3 times on the wrong door? Mason was treated for smoke inhalation. Spent 2 nights in the hospital. The nurse on his first night was kind. An older woman with a tired smile and soft hands. She asked if the fire had taken anything valuable. Mason said no. Then she asked if he wanted the window left open while he slept. He almost said yes, but then he heard it. A soft whistle from outside. Faint, trailing off into the night like it wasn't quite ready to be forgotten. "No," he said, "keep it closed." He never went back to Chatham. Not even when his father called to say someone had bought the land, planning to build a hunting cabin. Mason begged him to tell the buyers. Warn them, but his father brushed it off. Said the house was gone. And with it, whatever nonsense had haunted it. Mason hung up without another word. But every year, every spring, he prepares. He changes his phone number, unplugs his vents, leaves town for a week and checks in with his mother and anyone else who might be alone. Because he's not stupid enough to think fire kills something that was never alive. It only slows it. And maybe that's the worst part of all. Not the fear, not the memories, but the knowing that something remembers you, that you're a part of its story now. A verse in its song. So when the wind gets still and the air gets thick, Mason listens, and if he hears that broken, breathy tune again, he won't be surprised. Just sad. Sad for whoever it chooses next. If Mason's story shook something loose in you, if you've ever felt that chill, that knowing, you're not alone. Please like, share, and subscribe to After 0 Hours. These stories aren't just for thrills. They're warnings. And if, one night, you wake to a whistle at your door, don't answer. Because once it knows your name, it never forgets. Mason thought he could close the chapter for good the night the house burned. But what he didn't realize, what no fire could erase, was that the haunting never belonged to the house alone. It had latched onto something deeper. Something generational. A curse not etched into floorboards but into blood. The kind that hides in quiet corners of your lineage and waits for spring like a season of return. After the fire, Mason tried to live normally. He even started dating someone, Leah. A warm, grounded woman with a laugh that cut through the noise in his head. She never pushed, never asked too many questions. Just gave him space to heal, to breathe. For the first time since everything fell apart, Mason began to believe maybe he could have a life again, that he deserved one. But the thing about curses is, they don't care who you love. They don't care who you build a new life with. They just care that you forget, so they can remind you. It started again during his second spring in the city. Leah had stayed the night, and Mason had drifted off with her curled up beside him, peaceful and warm. But just after 1:17 a.m., something woke him. Not a sound, not a shadow, just that feeling, like a thread behind his ribs being tugged. He sat up, breath catching in his throat. The room was still, too still. He glanced at the vent near the floor. Nothing. But then, Leah stirred beside him. Eyes still closed, lips moving like she was dreaming. Mason leaned closer. She was whistling. Same broken tune. Off key. Slow. He shook her gently. Leah, hey, wake up. She blinked up at him, confused, then startled at the panic on his face. You were whistling, he said, in your sleep. I don't know. She whispered. I had a dream. Someone was outside, calling my name. Mason felt the blood drain from his face. He rose and double-checked every window. Every lock. Nothing. No sign. But he didn't sleep the rest of the night. He sat on the couch, shotgun across his lap, listening to Leah's soft breathing and waiting for the wind to carry that familiar melody again. But it never came. Not for another 2 weeks. Then one evening, Leah didn't show up for their usual Thursday dinner. He called. No answer. Texted. Nothing. When he drove to her apartment, her car was still in the lot. Her lights were off. But something was wrong, he knew it. He knocked. No response. He finally called building security. Said he hadn't heard from her. When they unlocked the door, Mason's heart stopped. Leah was there, curled in a chair in the corner of the living room. Awake, but gone. Her eyes were open but unfocused. Her lips were moving, humming something inaudible. There were 3 scratches across her left cheek. Fresh and deep. Mason rushed to her, dropped to his knees. Leah, baby, what happened? She looked right through him and whispered. He said you left him in the fire. Mason choked back a sob. The paramedics said it was a dissociative episode. Trauma. Maybe she saw something that scared her. Maybe she hurt herself in panic. But Mason knew better. He held her hand in the whispering apologies over and over. This wasn't just his curse anymore. He'd brought it to her. It had followed him, and now it wanted her. The doctors admitted her for psychiatric observation. Said it might be temporary. But days passed. Then a week. Leah didn't come back. Mason visited every day, sometimes just sitting beside her as she stared into corners of the room and murmured the same broken tune. The same one that had haunted his grandfather. The same one that had wrapped itself around him like barbed wire in the dark. Then one day, she turned to him, really looked at him, and said, "It was wearing your face." Mason couldn't breathe. "I opened the door," she whispered. "I thought it was you." That night, Mason left the hospital and drove to the ruins of the house in Chatham. Nothing was left now, just a patch of overgrown earth. Some melted metal, half a chimney standing like a monument to suffering. He stood there in the moonlight, fists clenched, and screamed into the woods. "You want me? Then take me, but leave her alone. Do you hear me? Leave her." But the woods didn't answer. Not that night, not the next. But on the third night, at 1:17 a.m., his phone rang. No number, just static. He answered, and the whistling began. But this time, it was Leah's voice humming the tune. And something else whispered through it. Not words, not language, just hunger. Mason fell to his knees. He finally understood. It didn't want to kill. It wanted to change, to hollow people out, to wear their voices, to become them. It had done it to his grandfather. It had tried with him. Now it was trying with Leah. And maybe, just maybe, it had succeeded once before. Maybe that pale figure in the hallway hadn't been stalking him at all. Maybe it had been his grandfather. What was left of him? And that's when Mason made his decision. He didn't go back to the city. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He disappeared. No note, no goodbye, just vanished, but not into despair. Into the woods. Into the place where it had all started. Because if it wanted to become him, he'd give it something it couldn't copy. Sacrifice. He took only what he needed. One last recording device. His grandfather's locket, the tape, and he walked into the trees. The last anyone heard from Mason was a voicemail left on his mother's phone. Mom, if you're hearing this, I'm sorry, but I think I found a way. I think I can trap it. It only knows voices, it doesn't know love. If I can keep it here, it won't follow anyone else. Take care of Leah. Don't let her forget who she is. And then, the sound of leaves crunching. A slow, broken whistle. Then silence. And if you're still listening, still with us this far into Mason's story, thank you. You've heard more than most people ever will. Please like, share, and subscribe to After 0 Hours so Mason's story lives on. Because maybe, just maybe, if we remember him, it can't become him. Not fully. Not forever. It had been 5 years since Mason disappeared into the woods, leaving nothing but a message and the sound of whistling trailing into silence. No body, no signs, no final confirmation of anything, just absence and the aching mystery of what really happened to him. But the world didn't stop. Leah, after months of inpatient treatment, slowly began to recover. The humming stopped, the vacant stares faded, and eventually, she started speaking Mason's name again without shaking. She never stopped loving him. Never stopped wondering what had really become of the man who tried to protect her from something too dark for language. When her parents suggested she leave the city and stay with family for a while, she agreed, hoping the distance might help her heal. She packed what little she had, climbed into the back of her uncle's pickup, and was driven deep into a sleepy, wooded town in Kentucky where the land was older than memory. The air was different out there. Still, heavy, alive. But Leah never truly escaped the weight of Mason's story. It wasn't something you could outrun. Not once it had seen you. Some nights, she still woke at 1:17 a.m., heart pounding, hands gripping the sheets like she was bracing for something unseen. But there were no sounds. No footsteps. Just a feeling that someone was standing just beyond the edge of the bed, waiting for her to open her eyes. She never did. Until one night. She had been there nearly 2 months. Staying in the old guest house at the edge of her uncle's property. It was small, just one bedroom, a kitchenette, and a view of the endless woods behind it. That night, a storm rolled in, painting the windows with rain and humming against the roof. She had almost fallen asleep when she heard it. Knocking. 3 slow, hollow thuds on the back door. Leah sat up, frozen. The wind screamed outside. Her phone said 1:17 a.m. She hadn't heard that knock since before Mason disappeared. She waited, breath shallow. Another knock, this time softer. Then, her name. Leah, it's me. It's Mason. I need you to open the door. Tears blurred her vision. That voice. She would have recognized it anywhere. But she didn't move. She couldn't. Her soul remembered what her mind tried to forget. What Mason had warned her about. How it learns. How it copies. But then, please, the voice said again, cracking, I'm not it. I got out. I found a way. A sob tore from her throat. She slid out of bed, feet bare on the cold floor, slowly making her way to the back door. She didn't open it, just rested her forehead against the wood. If it's really you, she whispered, tell me something only we know. Silence. Then, you were wearing my hoodie the night I told you I loved you. You said it still smelled like me, even though I hadn't worn it in a week. Leah's breath hitched. That was true. But the thing about it was, it remembered. It learned. Mason had said so himself. She stepped back from the door, tears streaming down her face. If it's really you, she said, voice trembling, you'd tell me to run. Silence again, longer this time. And then, from the other side of the door, run. A second later, something slammed into the wood. She screamed, stumbling back as the frame cracked, the door warping under the pressure of something massive, something angry. She bolted for the front, rain pounding the windows, the wind howling with voices now, hundreds of them, familiar, wrong, whispering her name over and over. She ran barefoot into the mud, across the yard toward her uncle's house, sobbing. The sky split with lightning behind her. Just as she reached the porch, she heard the door of the guest house give in. Whatever it was, whoever it was in. Her uncle came to the door just in time to catch her collapsing into his arms. They called the police, but when they checked the guest house, it was untouched. The back door intact, no signs of forced entry, no footprints in the mud. Leah swore up and down that she hadn't imagined it. Her uncle believed her. He'd grown up in that town. He'd heard the stories, things people didn't talk about until they had to. And now, he was scared too. They set up cameras around the property, motion lights, even blessed the land with a preacher from 3 towns over. But Leah knew, none of it would matter. Because it wasn't after anyone else. It was after her. 3 days later, a package arrived in the mailbox. No return address, just her name, scribbled in a hand she recognized. She opened it with shaking fingers. Inside, a cassette tape, labeled in the same faded handwriting. Spring, 23, for Leah. Do not play alone. Her knees buckled. She hadn't seen that handwriting since Mason disappeared. She didn't play the tape. Not at first. But 3 nights later, she woke again at 1:17 a.m. This time, not to knocking, but whistling. Inside the house. From the kitchen, she grabbed the tape and the old recorder she hadn't used in years. Pressed play. Mason's voice crackled through the static. If you're hearing this, I didn't make it out. Not all of me. Part of me stayed. That's how it works. It splits you. Leaves a copy. But I tried. God, I tried. I love you. You were the only thing it couldn't mimic. It tried, Leah, but it couldn't feel you. That's why it's angry. The sound of branches snapping. Wind. Then, I bought you time. But spring comes every year. And it remembers. The tape stopped. Outside the window, the whistling stopped too. Leah sat there in silence. Heart cracked open, hands trembling over the recorder. She understood now. Mason hadn't just given his life. He'd bound himself to it. To slow it down. To keep it from becoming her. And if you've stayed with this story, if your chest is tight and your breath is shallow, thank you. Thank you for listening to the truth no one else will say. Please like, share, and subscribe to After 0 Hours. Because someone needs to remember Mason. Because every spring, it comes back. And next time, it might not knock. It might already be inside. Leah never touched the tape again. She kept it locked away in a small wooden box beneath her bed. Wrapped in cloth like a wound that never quite healed. She couldn't destroy it. It was the last piece of Mason she had. His voice, real, raw, breaking through the static like a lifeline cast from whatever space still held him. But even as days turned to months, the whistling didn't return. The scratches on her soul remained. But the nights were quiet. For a time. Then, in the early days of the next spring, just as the first green began to push through the thawed soil, Leah received a letter. No return address. Just a blank envelope with her name written in the same careful, slanted handwriting she hadn't seen since she was a child. Inside was a single photo. A grainy image of an old, boarded-up house. A place she recognized instantly. Her grandmother's house in Ohio. A place she hadn't been in over a decade. A place tied to a part of her life she'd almost forgotten until now. Written on the back in faded red ink were 3 words. It started here. The memories hit her like ice water. That house. The backyard with the sagging swing set. The shed she was never allowed to go near. Her grandmother's strange habits. Salt at every windowsill. Bells hanging on each doorknob. And that old rocking chair she swore kept it away. Leah remembered, too, the whispers at night. The clicking sounds under her bed. The way her grandmother would sit with her, brushing her hair with trembling hands and murmuring, "You just have to make it to sunrise." Back then, Leah thought it was all just old woman superstition. But now, after Mason, after the whistling, after the voice at the door, she knew better. Something had followed her even before she met Mason. Something that never forgot. Something that passed itself down like a family heirloom, latching onto generations like a parasite. And maybe it hadn't just started with Mason. Maybe it had started with her. She didn't tell anyone. She packed a small bag, booked a rental car, and drove 8 hours north to Ohio. She didn't stop to eat. Didn't turn on the radio. The drive felt like a descent. Each mile pulling her closer to something buried not just in the earth, but in her blood. When she arrived, the house looked even older than she remembered, grayer, more sunken, like it had been exhaling for years and was finally ready to collapse. The front steps creaked in familiar protest as she climbed them. Heart pounding. She didn't have a key. But the door was already cracked open. Inside, the air was thick. Dust floated like ash. Every corner of the house hummed with a low vibration. Like something deep inside the walls was awake. Leah moved room to room, trailing her fingers across the furniture still covered in yellowing sheets. She didn't call out. She didn't need to. Whatever was here, knew she was. In her grandmother's bedroom, the bells were still on the doorknobs. The salt piles had long since crumbled to dust. But the rocking chair remained. And in it, an envelope. Leah approached slowly, the floor groaning beneath her feet. Inside the envelope was a page from a journal. Her grandmother's handwriting, fragile but steady. It came for me first in '62. When I was 16, it wore my sister's face. Said she wanted to play. I let her in. She died a week later. They said it was fever. But I know better. It leaves pieces of itself behind. Whispers, tunes, and it waits until you have something to lose. Something to mimic. That's how it grows. Leah sat on the edge of the bed, the paper trembling in her hands. Her entire family, every woman on her mother's side, had lived with this thing. Fought it, and none of them had ever said a word. Not out of shame, but because speaking of it gave it a path. And maybe, just maybe, that's why it had fixated on Mason. Because Leah had loved him enough to speak his name. And now, he was part of the song. She spent the night in the house. Not by choice. The roads had flooded after a sudden storm, cutting her off from town. She lit candles like her grandmother used to. Placed bells on the door. But at 1:17 a.m., the bells didn't ring. Instead, the rocking chair moved, slowly, back and forth, empty. Leah couldn't breathe. From the hallway, she heard footsteps, soft, bare, like a child walking through sleep. She turned toward the door and saw her grandmother. Or something that looked like her. But the eyes were wrong. Hollow, starless. The thing stepped into the room and smiled. And then it whistled. That same broken melody. Slow and off-key. Like a lullaby for the dead. Leah backed away until her legs hit the bed. She remembered the journal. The rules. Don't speak to it. Don't follow it. Don't let it know your name. But then the thing opened its mouth and in Mason's voice said, "I never stopped loving you." Tears welled in her eyes. Her lips parted. She wanted, so badly, to believe it was him. That some piece of him had survived. That this was a mercy. Not a mimicry. But Mason had warned her. He knew it would use him. So she did the only thing she could. She reached into her bag and pulled out the cassette player. Pressed play. And let his real voice fill the room. Let the truth wash over whatever this thing was. Even as it hissed and shrank and twisted in on itself. She screamed over the sound. "He's not yours," and threw salt at the thing's feet. It howled, a terrible, fractured sound, then vanished. By sunrise, the house was still again. Leah left that morning. She hasn't returned. But she made one decision before she left, to record everything. To speak the truth. To finally break the silence that let this thing thrive. And now you've heard it. You've felt it. You've been pulled into a story older than names and deeper than sleep. So if you're listening to this, please like, share, and subscribe to After 0 Hours. Because silence is how it survives. But memory is how we fight back. And if one night, the tune starts playing near your door, don't ask who's there. Just run. Leah thought she'd finally escaped it. That the whispers, the whistling, the night Mason's voice echoed through something that wore her grandmother's face, were the last of it. She thought speaking the truth, telling her story, breaking the silence, had buried the thing once and for all. She kept the salt. She kept the tape. She even kept the bells on her bedroom doorknob like a scar she had learned to live with. But time, as she would come to learn, does not heal what was never meant to be forgotten. Evil has a memory. And it waits. It waits for generations. 6 months passed. Leah moved back to the city. Into a third-floor apartment with no crawl space. No woods. No storm-bent fences or sheds that whispered in the dark. She started volunteering at a trauma support center. Helping others tell their stories. It made her feel whole again, useful. Like her pain had grown a purpose. Slowly, gently, she even let someone new into her life. His name was Aaron. He was kind in the quietest ways, refilling her tea without asking. Always standing on the side of traffic when they walked. Never once making her feel like she owed him an explanation. He didn't know about Mason, or the whistling, or the tape. At first, She told herself she was protecting him, but deep down, she feared that saying Mason's name again would let it in, so she held it close. Too close. Then, one crisp October morning, she opened her mailbox to find a small manila envelope with no return address. Inside, a drawing, crude, childlike, a house on fire, a woman in the window, and written in scratchy pencil, "You left me in the woods." Her breath hitched, her vision swam. She rushed back into the apartment, bolted the door, and fell to her knees, trying to breathe. For hours, she didn't move, just stared at that drawing until the sun dipped behind the skyline. That night, she finally told Aaron everything. From the first knock to the voice at her grandmother's house. The fire, the tapes, Mason. He didn't flinch, he didn't laugh, he just held her. And for the first time, Leah let someone carry the weight with her. The next few nights were quiet. The drawing went into a drawer. The salt was refreshed. The bells stayed up. Then, one night, just past 1:15 a.m., she heard humming. Not whistling, humming, soft and low, like someone gently mimicking a lullaby. It came from the hallway outside her bedroom. But when she looked, no one was there. The air felt cold, and the walls felt closer than usual. But no footsteps, no voices. She sat in bed, clutching Aaron's hand, and whispered, "Don't say anything, just listen." The humming faded, but the next morning, they found scratches, tiny, deliberate marks along the inside of the front door, as if something with fingernails had been tracing its way in. Aaron, trying to be helpful, installed a camera above the doorway. Motion detected, audio enabled, just in case. It recorded nothing for 5 nights. Nothing but silence and empty hallways. Then on the 6th night, at exactly 1:17 a.m., it recorded this. The hallway light flicked on. The camera caught static for 3 seconds. And then, a shape. Tall, lean, head cocked slightly to one side. Not visible directly, but reflected in the mirror at the far end of the hallway. It stood there, watching, listening. Then, on the audio, a voice, faint, childlike, but layered with something else underneath. It said, "Aaron, she told you everything. That was a mistake." Then static. Leah screamed when she heard it. Aaron turned white. He stayed up all night, shotgun across his lap, never blinking toward the hallway. But the thing never returned that night, or the one after, until the 3rd night, when Leah woke up to find Aaron gone. His phone, his wallet, his boots, all still there. The front door was locked. And there, on the kitchen table, was the salt from the windowsill, poured into the shape of a spiral. And at the center, a cassette tape labeled, "For him." Leah sobbed until her ribs ached. The police searched everywhere. No signs of forced entry. No surveillance of him leaving. No footprints. Just gone. Like Mason. Like all the others. They filed him as a missing person. But Leah knew better. She didn't even play the tape. She couldn't. She burned it in the sink that night, watching the plastic melt with her hands shaking and her soul caving in. And then, the guilt came. Crushing and merciless. She had told herself telling Aaron would protect them. That honesty could cut through whatever the curse was. But maybe Mason had been right. Maybe speaking it gave it shape. Maybe loving someone with that shadow behind you only handed it someone new to mimic. Leah stopped eating, stopped answering the phone. She couldn't go back to work. Couldn't bring herself to face the support group full of people she had once helped feel seen. She was haunted, yes, but more than that. She felt cursed, a carrier of something no prayer or logic could explain. She didn't sleep for days. Until the letter came, slid under her door sometime during the night. Written in familiar slanted handwriting. "Mason's. You were right. Love is the only thing it can't mimic. That's why it took Aaron. It wants to learn you. To be you. It wore me for years before I realized I was already gone. Don't fight it like I did. Trap it. Use its rules against it. It remembers pain. Make it afraid of yours." And then, below the writing, a photo. Blurry, grainy, but unmistakable. Aaron, standing in the woods, eyes closed, mouth open, as if whistling. Leah collapsed. It wasn't over. It would never be over. Not until someone turned the hunt around. Not until someone made it the one who was afraid. And so Leah made a new decision. She would go back to the house her grandmother once sealed. The place where she first heard the whispers as a child. She would set the trap there, just like the ones her grandmother never finished. She would lure it, let it think she was breaking. Let it believe it had finally won. And then, she'd burn it down again. Not just the house, but it. Once and for all. But first, she had to find Aaron. Because if there was still any piece of him left, any echo of the man who'd once held her in the dark and promised he believed her, then she would bring him home. Even if it meant facing the woods again. Even if it meant walking straight into the spiral. And if you're still listening, still here, still breathing through the fear, thank you. Your ears may be the only protection Leah has left. Please like, share, and subscribe to After 0 Hours, not for clicks, not for fame, but because someone has to remember her story. Because if it forgets her name, it might forget its power. And if one night, the humming starts near your door, don't speak, don't follow, and above all, don't love it back. Leah didn't sleep the night she decided to go back. Not really. Her body rested, but her mind moved like a current, dragging her deeper into memories she tried to bury. The sound of Mason's voice on that final tape. The way Aaron's hand had always lingered for a moment longer than necessary on her back. The drawing of the house on fire with her figure in the window. She clung to those pieces like they were life rafts. The city no longer felt safe. Every shadow stretched too long. Every silence felt like it was listening. It wasn't paranoia anymore, it was pattern. A cycle. A design. She had become the center of something ancient. Something that fed off love. Off memory. Off grief. And now that it had taken Mason and swallowed Aaron whole into the silence, it wanted her to watch. That was its final trick. It didn't want to kill her. It wanted her to hurt. To mourn. To break. So Leah did the only thing she could. She packed a single bag, laced her boots tight, and returned to the place she had once tried to escape forever, the house in Chatham. She got there just after sunset. The air was thick, damp like the world had been holding its breath all day waiting for her to arrive. The land was different now, overgrown, splintered, jagged with silence. Nothing remained of the house Mason had burned to the ground years ago. Just an uneven patch of earth surrounded by blackened tree trunks that never grew back. But the soil was cold, unnaturally so. It pulsed faintly under her boots. Like a heartbeat, she didn't wait for nightfall. She began digging, not for a grave, but for the box. The one Mason had buried in the crawl space before he vanished. It had held clippings, his grandfather's journals, warnings, and maybe, just maybe, something more. 2 feet down, her shovel struck wood. Inside, the same faded envelope with red ink notes. The same stack of yellowing papers, and something new. A second tape, not labeled, just a smudged fingerprint on its side. She stared at it for a long time, then tucked it into her coat pocket. She lit a fire that night and waited by it with the recorder in her lap. Around her, the woods whispered with movement that never showed itself. Trees creaked without wind, leaves shifted without footsteps. And then, at 1:17 a.m., it began. The whistling, not around her, not behind her, but from inside the recorder. She hadn't pressed play. The tape hadn't moved, but the sound leaked out like it had always been there, waiting. And then a voice, hers, calling out Aaron's name, over and over, as if pleading, as if possessed. Her eyes stung, her throat tightened. She wanted to scream, to rip the batteries out of the recorder. But she couldn't move. Something held her still. And then, the whistling stopped. Footsteps followed. Leah turned slowly, her body ice. At the edge of the trees stood Aaron. Barefoot, dirty, eyes wide, locked on her. Aaron, she whispered, voice breaking. He took 1 step forward. Leah, he said, I found a way back. Her knees buckled. She stumbled toward him but stopped just feet away. His skin, too pale. His movements, too precise. Say something only you would know. She begged. His smile flickered. Your grandmother's salt. The bells. The way you laugh when you're scared. Too vague. It knew those things. She stepped back. Aaron's smile faded. You told me everything, he said flatly. That was a mistake. Her heart dropped. It was wearing him. He stepped closer. She screamed and ran, not toward the trees, but toward the fire. She dug through the bag, pulled out the salt and the matches. The wind howled around her like the forest itself was protesting. You don't get him, she shouted. You don't get me. The thing in Aaron's body began whistling, mocking, twisting the melody into something unbearable. Leah threw the salt in a circle around herself, then took out the tape. Her hands trembled as she pressed play. Mason's voice, shaky, whispered, If you're here, and it's still coming, there's one thing it can't survive. It's not fire. It's not salt. It's grief. Real grief. You have to feel it. You have to let it in, and then refuse to let it stay. That's how you end it. The recorder went silent, and Leah, sobbing now, dropped to her knees. She closed her eyes and thought of Aaron. The way he used to hum in the kitchen. Always off key. The way he had stayed the night she told him everything. Whispering, "I believe you." The way Mason had recorded a final message just for her. Even as he was swallowed by something unnameable. The way love had become a beacon and a weapon. She let it crash over her. Every death. Every scream. Every time she should have said goodbye and didn't. She let it tear her open. And then, she screamed it back. "No, no more. I carry them now. Not you." The fire roared. The trees shook. The figure that wore Aaron's face screamed, not with human vocal cords, but like a mountain being split in two. Its skin began to blacken, split, and drip. The face twisted. Mason's voice, her grandmother's voice, her own voice, all echoed from its open mouth. But Leah stood, eyes dry now. "You remember pain?" she said. "Then remember mine." She stepped through the circle of salt and into the fire. The flames swallowed the tape. The figure wailed. And then, silence. Real silence. Not waiting. Not watching. Just peace. When she woke, the ground was cold. The fire had gone out. The trees were still. She walked alone back through the forest. Her throat raw. Her heart shattered but intact. She didn't find Aaron's body. She didn't find Mason's. But she carried them with her. Always would. And if you've made it this far, if your heart ached with hers, if your breath caught when she stood in that fire, thank you. You heard her. You remembered. Please like, share, and subscribe to After 0 Hours. Because the only way to bury this thing for good is to make sure she is never forgotten. And if you ever hear someone you love calling you from the woods, ask them one thing first. Are you still you? And if they smile before they answer, run. Leah didn't expect the healing to happen in pieces, but that's how it came. After that final night in the woods, after she stood in the circle of fire and grief and screamed back everything the thing had tried to take from her, something changed. The whistling never returned. The footsteps in the hall went silent. The tape recorder, once alive with voices that didn't belong to the living, was quiet. For the first time in years, Leah could sleep without waking at 1:17 a.m. Her body still flinched at certain sounds. Her eyes still scanned corners for movement. But it was no longer fear, it was awareness. Like she'd been forged by something ancient and wrong and walked out of it stronger. She still thought of Mason. Of Aaron. Not with the same raw ache that left her breathless. But with something gentler. Reverent. Like she was holding a memory that could finally rest. It wasn't the end of the pain. But it was the end of the haunting. She moved again, not to run, but to rebuild, this time to a small town near the coast, where the sea hummed through open windows and the air always smelled of salt and wind. There were people there, real ones. She joined a community center, taught local kids art therapy, and opened a small coffee shop named The Third Bell, after the sound that used to terrify her and now made her smile. Her days were filled with laughter, paint-streaked hands, and stories that didn't end in silence. And then one morning, while wiping down the shop's windows, she heard a sound she hadn't heard in years, whistling. She froze. But when she turned, it was a child. A little boy, no older than 6, hopping down the sidewalk in bright yellow rain boots, whistling to himself, off-key, joyful, harmless. And Leah smiled. That was the moment she knew, it was over. The horror hadn't been just about the thing in the dark. It had always been about what it tried to take, your sense of safety. Your trust in the people you love. Your belief in yourself. But Leah had taken all of that back. Every time she told her story. Every time she helped someone else speak their own. It lost power. And in that truth, Leah found the only ending that ever really mattered, peace. 2 years later, she received a letter in the mail. It was handwritten, no return address. But the penmanship was unmistakable, Mason's. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No explanations. Just a quote in his looping, steady handwriting. You are not what you survived. You are what you built afterward. She pressed it to her heart, closed her eyes, and let the warmth in. Maybe Mason had found a way to survive after all, some small part of him. Somewhere, free from the woods and the whispers. And maybe, just maybe, Aaron was at peace too. Leah now speaks publicly. Not about the creature or the fire or the disappearances, but about trauma. About surviving the things people say you're making up. About believing in yourself when no one else does. About the importance of being seen. She started a podcast called After 0 Hours, sharing stories sent to her by others who had faced the unexplainable, the terrifying, the deeply personal and often invisible. And in each episode, she ends with the same message. What hunts you loses its power when you tell the truth. Say it out loud, share it, give it nowhere to hide. And people listen, they cry, they heal. Together, Leah found love again, not in the desperate kind, not in the fear of being alone, but in friendship, in connection, in building something that mattered. She never forgot Mason or Aaron. She lit a candle for them every spring, placed a sunflower on her windowsill, and whispered a promise. You're safe with me now. And if you've followed her story this far, if you felt the fear, the heartbreak, the resilience, it matters. Because this story wasn't just about survival. It was about transformation. Leah didn't just escape the monster. She rewrote the ending, with her own hands, her own voice, and her own heart. Here's what her story teaches us. What it leaves behind like footprints on a once haunted floor. Listen to your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Silence feeds darkness. Speak your story, even if your voice shakes. You are not defined by the things that tried to destroy you. You are defined by how you lived after. Grief is not weakness. It is proof that you have loved. And that love was real. Healing is not loud. Sometimes it's quiet, soft, slow, and still holy. And maybe most importantly, believe people. Especially when their story doesn't fit the world you're comfortable in. Your belief might be the lifeline that saves them. If you connected to Leah's journey, if you cried with her, feared for her, or felt hope when she smiled at that boy on the sidewalk, please leave a comment to support her. Let her know her strength mattered. Like this video, share her story, and subscribe to After 0 Hours for more true stories of survival, silence, and the fight to reclaim what haunts us. We release new stories every week, and each one is a reminder that even the darkest hour, after 0 hours, can be followed by light. So if you hear something at night, a sound that echoes a memory you tried to forget, don't let it grow in silence. Tell someone. Tell us. We're listening. And we believe you. Always.